Hello students. So I'm back with the part 2 of friction chapter. Okay. Now in this video we are going to study the rest of the part of the chapter. So now depending of friction, the friction depends on both of the surfaces in contact. In our last video we saw what was the cause of friction. Now the friction depends on both of the surfaces in contact. When the hockey puck slides on the ice, a thin layer of water between the rubber and the ice allows the puck to slide easily. Why? Because both the surfaces are smooth. So obviously the friction is depending on both of the surfaces. Now we are going to study the factors affecting friction. So friction depends on materials properties such as roughness, how clean the surfaces are, and the other factors. So the friction depends upon two factors. So first is nature of the surface in contact, that is the smoothness or roughness of the two surfaces, and secondly the force with which the two surfaces are pressed together, or how hard the surfaces press together. So, the force of friction, however, does not depend on the amount of surface area of the two objects which is in contact with each other. So, now let us study both of these factors in detail. So, firstly, the dependence of friction on the nature of the two surfaces. Now, when the two surfaces in contact are smooth, then the friction between them will be small because the interlocking of smooth surface is less. Now, as the degree of roughness of the two surfaces in contact increases, the friction also increases. And when the two surfaces in contact are very rough, then the friction between them will be very large because the interlocking of very rough surface is too much. Thus, the friction depends on the nature of the two surfaces. And second point is dependence of friction on the force with which two surfaces are pressed together. So friction is caused by the interlocking of irregularities of the two surfaces when one object is placed over another object. If the two surfaces of objects are pressed together harder by a greater force, then the friction will increase. Because pressing together the two surfaces of objects with a greater force will increase the interlocking of the two surfaces. And therefore, the friction between two surfaces depends on the force with which the two surfaces are pressed together. Now we have studied so much about the causes of friction and the factors affecting friction and the different types of friction. Now friction is also known as a necessary evil. Friction force plays an important role in our daily life. In some cases, friction is useful and we want to keep it, but in other cases, friction is harmful. Now, let us study some usefulness of friction. So, friction is useful for many of our daily activities. It is possible to hold a tumbler due to friction between the hand and the tumbler. The friction between the feet and the ground helps us to walk on the ground. We are able to walk on ground because friction between the sole of our shoes and the ground prevents us from slipping over the ground. Now how does this takes place? In order to take a step forward during walking, we lift one foot off the ground and push the ground backwards with the other foot. If there were no friction between the sole of our shoe and the ground, then our shoe on the ground would slip backwards. Since we push the ground backwards, the force of friction acts in the opposite direction, forward direction, and prevents our foot from slipping backwards. So, also we know that walking on slippery ground is difficult because the frictional force on slippery ground is much less, which may not be sufficient to prevent us from slipping. So therefore, for walking, frictional force is very much useful. Friction also enables a car to move on road without skidding. Then it enables us to apply brakes and slow down or stop a moving car. The brakes of Bicycles supposedly also work by friction only. When the bicycle is running, the brake pads of bicycle do not touch the wheels. There is a gap between them. But when we press the brake lever to apply brakes to the running bicycle, then the brake pads rub on the rims of the bicycle wheels. The friction between the brake pad and the rim prevents the wheel from moving ahead. Due to this, the running bicycle slows down and finally stops. Then, friction also enables us to write and draw on paper. It enables us to pick up and hold things in our hand. It is also important to anyone to drive a car. Nails can be fixed in a wall due to friction. It enables us to light a matchstick. Grooved tire treads allow space for water to be channeled away from the road tire contact point, allowing for more friction in wet conditions. Shoes are designed to increase the friction between their soles and the ground. It is possible to write on a blackboard due to the friction between the chalk and the blackboard. So, hence, we can now say that friction is a necessary evil. Now, there are also some of the ways in which the friction is disadvantageous to us, like friction wears away the soles of our shoes. The tires of vehicle wear out gradually due to friction. Friction wears out the rubbing machine parts. It also wears out the brake pads of vehicle gradually. It also wears out the step of staircases in buildings and foot over bridges. Then friction produces heat, which may cause damage to machines. It also reduces the efficiency of machines. It also slows down motion. Now, are there any ways through which we can reduce the force of friction? So, unless a force is constantly applied, the friction will slow all motion to a stop eventually. So, it is impossible to completely get rid of friction, but it can be reduced. The friction between a shaft, that is a long pole in the picture, and an outer part of the machine produces a lot of heat. So the friction can be reduced by placing ball bearings, as you can see in the next image, between the shaft and the outer part, which will reduce the friction. It cannot completely remove the friction, but we can reduce the friction. So the friction can be reduced by using lubricants like powders or oils and grease, then using rollers over wheels. Okay, now so how can friction be reduced? By applying lubricants to the rubbing surfaces. So when oil or grease is applied between the moving parts of a machine, a thin layer of oil or grease is formed between the two rubbing surfaces. This layer of oil separates the two rubbing surfaces a little bit, due to which the interlocking is reduced to a larger extent. Since the applying of oil or grease helps in avoiding interlocking between the two rubbing surfaces to a large extent, friction is reduced and movement becomes smooth. So then next is using ball bearings. Now ball bearing is a device which consists of a ring of small metal balls. The small metal balls of a ball bearing can roll freely. Ball bearings are designed to make the moving parts of a machine to roll over each other rather than slide. And we all know that rolling friction is much more less than the static and the sliding friction. Then wheels are used in vehicles to reduce friction. Ball bearings are used in ceiling fans, bicycles and vehicles to reduce friction. So now lastly we move on to fluid friction. Now what do you mean by fluid friction? So those substances which are able to flow easily are known as fluid. So thus the water and air are the most common fluids. There is friction whenever an object moves through a fluid. and that is known as the fluid friction. So the fluid friction depends upon the speed of the object, the shape of the object, and the nature of the object. You can see the shape of bird and aeroplane. It is a streamlined shape. This streamlined shape helps in reducing the fluid friction, and hence it allows the objects or the animal to move and to fly very easily and fast. Birds flying in the air have streamlined body to reduce fluid friction. Fishes living in water also have streamlined body to reduce fluid friction. And hence we can say that by this way fluid friction can be reduced. Also, the frictional force which is exerted by a fluid is known as drag. So hence, by now we have almost completed the chapter. Thank you for watching the video. Hope you liked it. Thank you everyone.